afforded to them by William Hunt in what would be called New Bilkholz, after their old village in eastern Germany. Trustees included Johann Wilhelm, Frederick Moll, and Jonathan Sy. Does any of those last names ring a bell?
Mm-hmm.
Hunt,
some of those 800
Moll, and Sy.
ended up in Martinsville and Walmart.
Also up in that area there?
Out of those 800, some of them ended up in Martinsville and some in Walmart.
Right, yeah, because they split off essentially when they got up into that area. Yep.
Well, the Martinsville people were mostly from two villages in the Uckermark that dealt with water-related activities.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go over to Martinsville, even nowadays, all the lots are, but they backing up to the water are long, thin lots, so that the people could practice their fishing and boat building and not making what they did. Now those two villages those people came from are now actually in Poland, because at the end of World War II, the border was moved so that Germany would not have a Baltic port, and that was Stettin.
Right, yeah,
So like
and it's called Stettin, the actual presentation.
Is now just over the border in Poland.
Yeah, because of a lot that's happened in the meantime over there. Now they had looked at 6 other sites before Wheatfield was chosen. It was cheaper land at $9 an acre, but required much more work to clear and prepare. Many trades existed here, 3 waves in total in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, so roughly half settled here in western New York and a further half west to Wisconsin, right? And then we had another wave that came in that basically followed the same rough pattern. Now, included in this purchase was 600 acres for future use by more settlers, including modern-day St. Johnsburg hamlet, 24 donated log cabins used as earlier shelters for workers, and the Flight of 5 Erie Canal locks. This is a renovation project that was done on the Flight of 5 area in the Erie Canal. The current Das Haus Museum, that little log cabin that if you visit the museum you'll be able to see, that was originally built for the workers for that renovation project at the Flight of 5, but it was never done. There was a labor dispute, here we go again, and they weren't able to actually house anybody. So these things are rotting in the meantime. These different cabins, all 25 of them or so, were rotting. They needed something to do with them. So these settlers were coming in just right off the Atlantic Ocean and right off the Erie Canalway and everything else, and they went to Buffalo and went through a lot more down there. So they needed shelters immediately as winter was coming on. So these were donated by Mr. Hunt down to this area and reassembled for those people.
Well, they actually tore them down and then moved them?
They were presumably already, essentially...
It seems like they were stored,
yeah.
marked and stored. All the logs have little marks on them, how to put them back together. So it seems like they were stored for future use.
I'm just going to go ahead, because he already mentioned.
Is that the only one that exists today?
No, there's a couple more. They're covered over, but you can almost, if you drive around the little side streets in Berkeley, you can almost pick them out because they're about 20 by 25 or so.
Okay.
There's maybe 3 more. In fact, there's one kitty corner from the museum going back toward Ward Road that I'd like to talk to the owners there and see whether you can tell there's been a lot of little extensions put onto the original building, but it looks like it probably was also.
It would surprise some people when certain buildings were demolished in different parts of town, how much older it turned out to be the more you chomped into it and the more you got to the core of these things. Kroll's Tavern was a good example of that. Within a lot of the base structure was a much older building dated back to the 1850s and built in the Fachwerk style, essentially, as opposed to the other style that you have in your home, for example. Very different periods, different methodologies, because again, you're talking about the old world reasserting itself on what was just much more basic construction here. Now, in addition to earlier churches, several more were added as founding centers of new hamlets that would define the early evolution of the town. Church services were first conducted in houses and barns until 1847, when the half-timbered Holy Ghost Lutheran Church was built. By 1852, this church had a membership of 1,300, essentially. A separate branch school and congregation opened in what was first called Little Berkholz, now St. Johnsburg, and its congregation in 1853. So these are just some pictures essentially shared right here of the Das Haus Museum campus, which you can, again, visit today. This is the original log cabin house here. It's got modern, modern as a Victorian era clapboard over the logs themselves, and it's 1890 edition off the back of it there. And then you see the barn reproduction right here. That was built in the 1980s as a reproduction of a typical Uckermark region barn. And then you've got the Ein House itself. This Ein House, we'll see in a picture a little later on, the bones of which inside of here are from the late 1840s, 1843 period, just after these log cabins were reassembled from Lockport. They started to finally build their own the very next season. And the beams that you'll see in this thing are absolutely huge. And they were used to working with these enormous skeletons, essentially of wood, right out of that area, and they just replicated what they did right here. So this is also a picture of the Widow's Maypole standing right in front of this little museum that you'll see later on in the 1890s. Note their size, by the way. We are generally about half a foot higher, across the board between both sexes. These are basically salt and pepper shakers compared to that. They're basically called. But they're essentially the same size. And look at the size of the fence next to them. Our modern day fence is of the same height. So when you actually go visit the museum, you'll be able to kind of compare yourself to the general size, the average size of people who lived back then. Napoleon Bonaparte's usually considered a short person. No, he wasn't. He had a tri-corner hat that was flat across like this, which from a distance kind of lowered his profile a little. And he was basically, I think, 5'6", which is an average height for the period. So that's part of the propaganda. Napoleon was fine, in other words. And that's what the little house looked like in 1958, actually, 1957-58. Again, from one of the old assessment card pictures. That was when it was still privately owned and still a rental property. So, okay, so here we have the Schmidt House, and this stood up until I think 1970, right? 1972. One of our Das Haus board members, Don Schroeder, everybody, right back there, are both board members in the same museum. Yeah, this was a featured article in the Sesquicentennial, or 1986 year, 150th anniversary of the birth of the town. And I should rather say this building was standing up until about that time, and then eventually was torn down. This stood next to St. James Church, right, on the north side of that street.
Wanted the lot, but there's a newer house there. But this is one of the interesting ones because you note the front door there in the middle. That's the door to the house. And then that door to the left, as we're looking at it, and there's a larger window there. That would have meant there was a craftsman that worked there because they had a separate door to get into the little shop or whatever he was making there. And then the bigger window was a lot more lighted.
I'm also told they tried to save this originally. They wanted
to. It was a factory house. Yeah. But again, as most of the factory houses, as they sank lower and lower into the ground, and the frost level in the Uckermark is slightly different than here. And all these factory houses were built on split fieldstone. So over the winters, every spring they would sink a fraction of an inch. And by my time, those bottom logs sat right on the soil and started to rot away.
Wow.
And if you didn't jack them up on occasion, like you illustrated the other day, we had an interview earlier, and he mentioned one house in particular where it was routine to go under there about once a year, a couple of years, jack up the center of the house and slide a new piece of stone in there just to keep the wood from coming down.
Plank house,
and that was Now again, I got to explain what fachwerk is. It's basically it's a material saving method of construction. I mean, you can build reasonably big, but also properly insulate the construction. We're dealing with a place that had more wood than where they were coming from. A lot of Europe was depleted of a lot of useful wood and easy access areas. So they developed a construction procedure whereby they built a large wooden frame from main member timbers. And then they would make smaller members essentially to fill in the gaps in between these large wooden beams. And then fill in between those pieces or slats with a mixture of clay and grass and straw and so forth, that kind of material, to and basically allow it to kind of bake in place by virtue of being exposed to sort of the elements on the outside. And on the outside, they would plank over a lot of this, or they would allow some of it to be exposed, because it was essentially a kind of cement anyways. And it would insulate the inside of the place while also saving on a lot of wood and other materials that they needed for to stretch, essentially, to go out to the whole community, to build as many shelters and places of business as possible. And that was just not just a habit, it was still an economical thing to do, even here.
Is that what we might call split timber?
Yeah, half timber.
Half timber,
Just like you
yeah.
see pictures a lot in England and continental Europe, you'll see pictures of the old houses with the half timbers and what looks like stucco to us, filled in the squares. That's exactly what it is. We have quite a few pictures over at the museum of buildings that are still standing in Europe, in New York.
This is, of course, the Burkholz band as they appeared in about 1960, essentially by the firehouse, essentially in the middle of the town there. So these are the occupations of the people who lived in town, essentially. The most common occupations, the town of Wheatfield inhabitants and their occupations, the most common occupation of Wheatfield settlers was farming. Walmore group included 84% of that population. The Burkholz group was 30% farming, and the Martinsville group just 21%, because as you figure, you go towards Martinsville, and that area, that was more angled towards trades that involve seafaring, essentially, or boat making, net making, things like that. So the town of Wheatfield occupations continue here with craftsmen or skilled workers. They were the next largest class of occupations. These artisans made up 49% of Burkholz and 46% in Martinsville and just 13% in Walmore. See a reversal there, what you're basically doing. In Martinsville, 17% were in prominent fishing operations since they lived by the Niagara River.
Where is Martinsville?
Martinsville exists.
North Tonawanda?
North Tonawanda,
Well,
right.
I know where that is. I couldn't conceive one in Wheatfield is the reason I asked the question.
Understandable, because Martinsville, up until about the 1860s, essentially, especially by the 1890s, that was part of Wheatfield originally. And then they voted to join what was now the city of North Tonawanda by the 1890s.
Okay.
It's confusing because, again, the county was still evolving even by the mid-1800s. And it's been a long time, and yet it hasn't been that long, really. When you consider the whole breadth of the history of this whole continent, it's a very small slice.
Justin, was North Tonawanda part of, just before it became a village or a city, was it just part of Wheatfield, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, a lot, except for the village, because the village portion was part of the village of the Tonawandas, essentially, village of Tonawanda, right, Howard?
In the village of Tonawanda, before North Tonawanda split off, there
Okay.
two wards in Erie County and one in Niagara County.
But before it became North Tonawanda, it was just part of Wheatfield.
Right,
Yeah.
part of Wheatfield as it was originally formed.
Yes.
This includes the Gratwick area, by the way, over there.
Yeah, it was an
Yeah.
unincorporated village. It's
Right,
kind of-
yeah, I think that's what you.
Wheatfield Street was Wheatland originally. I have a
Wheatfield
map.
Street was Wheatland, I think,
It's
wasn't
Wheatland.
it?
I have a map that has that now.
Thank you. Yeah,
Well,
that's
the
what I
whole
was trying to
area,
remember
because
earlier. Yeah.
Nut trees grew here and the heavy clay soil. So like with our group, the German farmers knew that was good wheat growing soil.
Mm-hmm.
And they knew to, like where Burkholz is, that whole surrounding area, when it was still just people came there, it was clumps of forest and clumps of swampy area. But those Germans were good farmers, and they knew how to drain the swamps. And of course, they cut down, that first winter, they were able to sell some of some of the logs and potash from burning that make ash.
This is it's not an aerial view of the village of Berkholz, but this was taken from the steeple of the Holy Ghost Church, the second Holy Ghost Church. And in the distance is the old St. Jacobi or St. James Church. Our Hasley Einhaus is but a dim shape among the trees. So what we preserve now is actually in this picture. You can't quite see it myself here, but this is what the village essentially looked like back then. And that's, of course, the Schmidt House a little earlier in its life, before the sesquicentennial in 1986.
So what was that previous picture taken?
The village picture? There, okay. Is that it?
Yeah. What time frame is that? Roughly, you know?
This is in one of our dirt briefs. I think it's the 1880s, right, Don?
I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure, yeah.
Dirt Brief is our quarterly newsletter that you can get by being a member of the society, by the way. So you can see stuff like this, plenty in there. Okay. This is one of the older houses that also existed in town from about the time of the Das Haus Museum there. And this is another assessment picture, and of course it's no longer there, and you can tell that because the assessor wrote demolished across the face of it. So not good for the picture, but that was their picture, That's the house that's down the way from it, by the way. Probably built in the late 1870s, early 1880s, and of course that was gone eventually too. So there's some other older surviving buildings in the village of Berkholz. Actually, these date more from the 1870s into 1918. So this is the Berkholz Fire Company's first building, and it's actually the first fire hall that we have in the town. And it was next to what would later become the meeting place on Niagara Road. That's what it looked like, again, in 1957. There were two other businesses down the way from this, where there's parking now for the Holy Ghost School area, further back, the new school. And so that's what was in that parking area on Niagara Road up until about 1965 or something like that. That's when they were taken up, maybe a little later on. But this is a good example of what was, essentially. And you go there now, it's just a space before the meeting place where people park, used to park to go into the meeting place or go into the school. And these two buildings were in that area originally. So in addition to the earlier churches, several more were, well, wait a minute. Sorry, we went through that. So, let me get to place here. Yeah, most other settlers arrived after the 1860s as individual families and businesses which would filter in and give the town a steady increase in population. From Wheatfield, many families moved westwards into the Midwest USA. We were a stepping stone, of course, into the greater western area, and that was the whole point of places like Old Fort Niagara. They were guardian stations for making sure that people were steadily moving further out and claiming more and settling more. A 1938 map shows other communities: Riverview on River Road, Gordman, an area surrounding Frontier Avenue and 102nd Street, Hoffman Station on Town Line Road, Nashville, Nash Road area, and Wurlitzer around the Clemmer area. So these are other settlements that were developing and making up the town at that point. By 1900, census data concludes that there were 1,926 inhabitants in our town. Today, this number is closer to 18,000 plus. Changes in population occurred due to many new developments in town, including the Wheatfield Farms Demler Cider Mills, an amusement park, the establishment of Bell Aircraft in 1940, and the founding of Carborundum plant in 1947. Colomar was developed shortly thereafter. The erection of the Summit Mall in 1971 on William Street, mostly on the Williams farmsteads, another indication of the population growth later on. And these are just little indications over the years, essentially, of population increase. And so, all right, so we got our volunteer fire halls. Basically, the first fire hall was founded in 1918, and it's across the street from the modern building that's there now. This complex was further expanded in 1979, so you go from 1918 to the original fire hall, 1949 to the new fire hall and the extension by 1979. It was a centerpiece for a number of community events in and of its campus, including the original and annual Burkholz Field Days, Oktoberfest, and presently their monthly charter sale. Other notable fire halls include Shawnee, which was founded in 1947. The current hall was built in 1967 in the Liberty Drive area. St. Johnsburg on Ward Road and Niagara Falls Boulevard in 1926. This was moved in 1969 to the Ward and Kruger Road area, and Frontier, which opened within the former River Road School in 1938, with a substation built in 1984, again in the Liberty Drive area. Adams was founded next to the historic Sawyer Creek Hotel, actually right behind it, on Niagara Falls Boulevard and Nash Road in 1924, and moved into their current location on Nash Road North in 1952. There is also a fire advisory board which acts as consultants to the town government. Until the 1950s here, the majority of children attended several one-room schoolhouses, and if anybody is still around from that time, well, actually you guys might be veterans of that system back in the day.
One-room schoolhouse under Mrs. Graff.
Which one was that?
It's on the boulevard, almost across from the gun shop, near Johnson's, I believe, service station, between Road Road and Nash Road on the boulevard, south side of the boulevard.
Oh, okay, right in there.
It's now a,
Is the shrine in
Okay.
Jesus shrine?
So you went to the number 3 one-room schoolhouse, actually.
My
So,
wife, Lois Clayton, went to the one in Shawnee. There's a schoolhouse there on Shawnee Road, right near Lockport Road. The intersection there used to be Durfee's. Have you heard of Durfee's
yes,
store?
yeah,
Well, it's
Yeah.
just this side of Durfee's. There was a schoolhouse, and she was from the Clayton farm down in Shawnee Road.
right up the way
And they
from
walked from the farmhouse, what was it, 3 miles to the school?
uphill all the way.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Both ways.
Jeez.
Both ways, yeah, both ways in the snow, even in the summer.
Well, you guys were lucky. You guys are lucky because, again, the consolidation that happened in the 1950s was both good and bad, because the consolidation gave a lot of extra bureaucracy essentially to the overall system, and you know, had other headaches. But at the same time, though, the old schoolhouses had a more community environment, and I'll tell you why in a moment here. Because the majority of children attended these, and they were built between the 1830s and the 1890s. These buildings held several grades at one time, actually, between 2 and 8 in single sessions, and with teachers, some old, some young, almost teenagers, actually, at, you know, essentially 20 years old, 19 years old in some cases, who tended to these classes. There might have been as many as 50 students at a time. Subjects included mathematics, history, geography, rhetoric, science, civics, English, and philosophy. The students were divided according to sex. So you come up to the front of many of these buildings, and the typical ritual was that the ladies went in first, and they went into one side and one separate doorway. The boys went into another side of the doorway. And if any of the ladies were having issues, the boys were meant to give way and allow them entrance in first. Younger children were tutored by the older ones, and there were fewer older children as they were needed on farms and the shops. Therefore, the equivalent of middle school was the extent of a typical child's education. You also had, of course, as I said, farms. You had different businesses, and these were not exactly healthy times for a lot of people. So if a father or mother died, the eldest child, or even the next one down, or the whole gang had to come back home and keep the business going, keep the food on the table, and that was the most important thing. So your whatever you happened to be at that point, that was it, and you came back home.
Justin, I went to a 2-room schoolhouse. The St. John's School, when I went there, was a 2-room schoolhouse.
Right in the St. Johnsburg area, it was a larger building for what it was.
First 4 grades on one side and the top 4 grades on the other side. 2 teachers for all the kids.
I have something to pass around for this, right here, actually. This is a recreation of your typical desk.
I used to sit in them.
I had one like that in the sunshine.
I'm used to them.
We've got some
That's what we
of
did.
And you do too, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But also, it wasn't just the one-room, schools that were,
God, that was
had
big.
boys' entrances and girls' entrances. The Washington Street School
I
at
tattooed
Delaware,
myself.
Delaware,
It
has
you
carved
had
above
to
some of the
dip
doors
right
and
in.
Oh, yeah.
boys at girls'
Mhm.
schools.
Exactly.
And
And
when,
there ever since. third or
Are you a
fourth
lefty?
grade.
Went to grab it.
Huh?
Are you a lefty?
I went to grab
Are you left-handed?
yeah, you
No,
did?
right.
One side, girls, one side.
I'm right-handed.
I went
I'm
to,
just
I have
I
a
don't know, I don't know how that
Sort of
happened,
relation to this too now. I am far too young to have traveled inside the one-room schoolhouse system, of course, or anything like that, or segregated schools, but at the same time, I did go to schools in Buffalo as part of a special education system way back in the day. And the last school I attended down there that they had utilized, left over from the olden days, was the Kenmore School. And half of that building was basically for boys, the other half was girls, and it had been built in 1940.
Yeah.
This was a 1940 era school, and carved in stone was still boys and girls.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
At Assumption School in Buffalo in Black Rock, it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Boys and girls entrance, and I'm sure they don't observe that anymore.
Not quite. In fact, our school system has become a little more complicated,
Mm.
you know, in that department too. But state levy.
And actually, those, well, Kenmore School and the Washington School aren't schools anymore.
That's right. Yeah, no, they're definitely not. And of course, these buildings were pretty sturdy, but you know, you couldn't use them forever. Does anyone remember the big schoolhouse fire in Buffalo area? It was in Cheektowaga almost.
Fleetwood Hill?
It was a huge thing. It was something like about 80 children died in that. And that had been used into the 1950s, and the building dated to about the 1880s, 90s.
I
So-
think they weren't in the school building. Because of overflow population, there were
Right.
some extra little buildings behind it, and that was where the fire was. I'm pretty sure. I've read some on that, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Pekin School burned down too.
And actually, the main
Sanford School burned down.
And this disc just being passed around had a little inkwell hole in the upper corner of the inkwell. And it was always a little temptation if you had a girl with long hair sitting in front of you to kind of dip her hair in the inkwell.
which actually is reenacted in the movie called The Little Princess in the early 1990s. A wonderful film. And the one new kid in the school was looking around nervously, and she's looking back, and the one woman's like, "You know how it is around here? Well, I'm going to take this girl. See her hair? I'm dipping in the inkwell. See that? I can do that, you know."
Never thought of that.
Yes, that's how you got the girl's attention.
Yeah.
You got in trouble.
And she was the nerd. She was the nerdier girl ahead of the other one. So, yeah. And these one-room schoolhouses were often heated by a single potbelly stove, which was tended to all day by the teacher and older students. There was no air conditioning, of course. Lunches could be held outside if the weather was nice. Books were few and had to be shared. An outhouse was the washroom all year round. Strict discipline was observed by all, and punishments were meted out often, especially in the early years. Desks were standardized, like the one you see there. The buildings could also double as we know, town halls, courts, and community centers. These buildings were closed closed due to later education reforms and the consolidation. Actually, there were other uses for these buildings. A few of them became law offices. There's actually one in East Amherst, a brick one-room schoolhouse there, if anyone kind of knows where that is, up there, and right very prominently there, it's still very handsome, but it's now the law office of fill in the blank, I don't know. But
It's at, is it North French? And
North
Yeah.
Forest.
North Forest.
and Naples, yeah.
This is a quote right here I want to read off to you that was submitted on Facebook with one of these pictures. With regards to the number one-room schoolhouse between 1951 and 52, she says, "The smiling little girl in the front row is me, Rosemary, in second grade 1951. There was no kindergarten, so my mother enrolled me 1 year early in 1950. My elder sister, Annette, was in the same room wearing an identical dress. We'll see the picture in a moment. Miss Mole, our wonderful teacher, prepared hot lunches assisted by the older students, 6 grades in one room. We played in the woods at recess, collecting cans of pollywogs for our science lesson. In winter, we sledded and played in the snow. The experience at this one-room schoolhouse formed my positive opinion of attending school and education for my entire life. So says Rosemary Barkley. And this is the picture she's referring to. I think, smiling girl in the front row, I think is her. This is the first row right here. The first 2 seats are empty. And here she is back in here, most likely. And this is what it still looked like by the early 50s. This is another picture of another class. This one from number 4. The first one was from number 1. This is number 4, schoolhouse. And again, this is the building that I had moved the slide earlier. But that is the one-room schoolhouse that the town fathers met in 1836. Again, that's number 7. And this is these are pictures of the same. This is a picture of the same building, actually taken about 20 years earlier. And this is a picture down here of, I think, the one off of the one near Holy Ghost. I'm not absolutely sure, but that's another one in the area. And that is the number 3 schoolhouse as it appeared by the late 1950s when it was converted into a church. And I won't read through this except to say that our Niagara Falls Boulevard is on the Niagara Historic Trail. Now, this was a program that existed up until about 2016, and hopefully it'll be revived. It was a program where the whole ring around Niagara County here would help people and tourists to visit different communities and patronize different businesses and visit different museums. Hopefully the Historic Trail will be revived as a program in this area eventually. These are pictures from the Elliman family photo collection. And the Elliman family lived on Niagara Falls Boulevard, which was then, by the way, just a 2-lane road. That was pretty much it. These were taken in the 1880s, 1890s, and this house isn't here anymore, but these are different pictures from the Elliman family that lived on that boulevard at that time. And you can tell what a very different boulevard it is now. And by the time this picture was taken, these might actually be cobblestones from when the Wurlitzer owner had actually paid for a lot of the boulevard to get done essentially down the way, just so that his customers and products would arrive safely and without a lot of damage. So this is when companies actually paid for whole streets to get done, just for their own factories to be able to prosper.
Near Johnsburg, my father said that when he was a little kid, he and his brother would take their little expressway and just 2 houses down and watch the workmen rebuilding. And at that time, it was just a 2-lane brick road through St. Johnsburg, through where Crossword Road.
Mm-hmm. Right in that area, there's another picture too, showing a family standing on top of some of these cobblestones, right at the side corner, and across the way from what's now Solidays restaurant there, which was back then Mahler's general store, and they were right in that area, and they were standing on top of the dirt and the bricks for that renovation work. This is the Kroll family bar and store area here. This comes from the Kroll family collection, and this is the side of the building as it appeared about 1950. I know you're at a distance, but there's all sorts of different advertising there. Coca-Cola, Michelin,